I want to talk today about a book I just finished, Education and a Time Between Worlds by Zach Stein. This book is fascinating. It's a collection of 6 essays which have been turned into a book. Zach Stein is an educational philosopher, but also hands-on doer who's studied education and is in the weeds working on many different projects to help build the future of education. I want to talk about 7 themes that jumped out from the book for me. 1 was the difference between education and schooling. 2 was the fact that Zach sees education as almost the root crisis of all the other crises we're experiencing in today's world. 3, a lack of a meta-narrative that gives people a script for how to engage with the world. 4, deschooling, some of the myths that go along with that and how we misunderstand teacherly authority. 5, some of the limits of technology and what that means for how we think about future systems we use. 6, measurement and control and how we drug students and what that means for the future of education, how we should think about the human, and also how we try to control people through testing and measurement and trying to turn people into people that pass tests. And finally, I'll talk about his imagination or our lack of imagination for a future education system that can work and what his vision looks like. The first powerful idea from this book is the differentiation between schooling and education. This is often something people mix up when they talk about what they want from education. On page 16, this quote is awesome. Education, as I use the term here, signifies more than what happens in schools. Indeed, a large part of what follows is an argument in favor of redesigning schools down to their foundation. Schooling, as we have known it, is just one form of education. I think this is powerful because when we think of education, we think of what happens in schools from age of about 5 to 22. This book flips it on its head and looks at learning and education as something that is more lifelong and core to the human condition, which makes this book so powerful. Stein makes the case in this book that the education crisis is the core crisis that feeds to all the other crises we've experienced. He gives the example of the financial crisis in 2008 of quote-unquote grown men who were highly educated, highly skilled, but made many of the wrong choices that took advantage of other fellow citizens and their neighbors and the financial system to enrich themselves. He's pretty harsh on grown-ups. Here he is on page 42. In most cultures around the world, so-called grown-ups are usually quite immature relative to the full spectrum of human capacities and potentials that are latent inside them. I think this is really a core theme of his book. He's harsh and critical of people, but he also leaves open the door, right? The latent capacities inside of people. He's hopeful. He's trying to say there is more. We can do better. He also argues that in times of crisis, especially in educational crisis, schools become contradictory. Here he is on page 87. When social systems are in periods of rapid transformation, the role of schools becomes contradictory. They teach knowledge that is no longer relevant, socialize individuals into roles that no longer exist, and provide the mindsets needed to continue of ways of life that are rapidly disappearing. This is something I personally write about a lot, that we've kind of lost touch with these myths and these ideas, these scripts, this American dream, this work hard and you'll be taken care of. Get good grades and you'll be taken care of. Many young people are finding that this is not true, and he's trying to call this out. And I think really highlights the fact that in these times of shifting narratives, shifting meta-narratives, and shifting myths, a lot of what we're doing through schools, maybe not all of education, doesn't make sense for what we claim we're trying to achieve. Early on in the book, in his introduction, around page 25 and 26, he highlights the fact that a lot of our thinking about education and schooling comes from human capital theory, which was developed after World War II in the United States. And this is really a rational understanding of what the human is. Invest money in this person and it will pay off later in terms of labor, wages, or returns to the total economy. he argues that this is a very limited way of conceiving of education and society at large. So on page 26, rather, reductive human capital theory is an assumed and largely unspoken consensus, which is one of the reasons it is so insidious and pervasive. This is powerful because he's making the argument, and I think pretty valid claim, that nobody's really there's no human capital czar, right? But this is a system that has emerged, and it's so deeply intertwined with our consciousness and how we think of education that we're trapped. We can't imagine new possibilities because the only way we see school is that it pays off in terms of a job or getting paid or living a successful life, right? He's pushing us to think a little bigger. The fourth thing that stood out from this book was him pushing back on some of the left thinking and saying, let's just let kids wander and learn on their own. They'll decide what they want to do. They're very curious and self-directed naturally. He calls this the cognitive maturity fallacy and says this is a mistake to take for granted things that are actually hard-won developmental achievements through teacherly authority. And teacherly authority, that term, you may not know what it means, but it's also something he coins here, which is to give credit to the type of authority that a teacher has over a student that is both credible and enables learning. He says that a lot of times this teacherly authority does not live up to its name. And instead what happens is three different types of teaching, one of which he thinks is ultimately the great ideal. One is doing something to someone, doing something for someone, and then the third is doing something with someone. And that third one is what he outlines as an ideal. I think many of us can flash back to our schooling experiences when young and think about experiences when we are told, you need to do this, you need to learn this, and then you will repeat it back in a week or 2 weeks. He argues that in the best relationship of teacherly authority, the teacher is actually learning from the experience as well and updating their ideas of what needs to be taught. Now, many of the conversations going on around the future of education focus a lot on technology and digital spaces, and he really pushes back on that. In addition to things like teacherly authority, he argues that a lot of our experiences in the digital world give us this sense of being in a placeless place, right? So I'm filming this video here. I'm in a different location than you. I'm not actually connected to you. This is information you're consuming from somebody else in a different environment. You don't have the opportunity to ask me questions and engage in dialogue and learning with me. And he points this out in saying not all informational environments are educational environments. And I think this is a really important thing because as the internet and the digital has taken over our lives and our minds, we are often confused with consuming information with learning. Learning is a much harder process. It takes teaching others. It takes practicing it yourself. It takes feedback. Those kind of things are not easy to recreate and require a rethinking of how we think about education with other people and with coaching and even using the digital space to kind of transcend some of that placeless place feeling and see what's the best we can make of these environments. So the sixth thing that stood out in this book was his essay, the third essay in the book, around the failed experiment of global measurement. And he talks about two things in this essay. He talks about one, our obsession with standardized testing that really took off after World War II. People like James Conant and the educational testing services really pushed testing as a way to really try to improve the outcomes of students. And two, he talks about the ADHD crisis, which is the overprescription of drugs for students. His argument is that we're conceiving of students as broken, except we should flip it, right? It's not the students that are broken and not succeeding in this school system. It's that the system is not adapted for the type of learning and education and schooling that needs to take place in the modern world. We talked about this previously with the misalignment with some of the meta-narratives. And he writes on page 165, "Today, the postmodern world is overrun with measures and standards, and although we may not realize it, much of the enemy and injustice of the postmodern life world is a result of the proliferation of the wrong kind of measures and standards." Anyone can quickly realize that your SAT score does not determine your ultimate success in life, except we've over-indexed so far into tests like the SAT to determine the outcomes and results of what people become and the roles they play in life that we've lost the script here. We're not actually enabling people to thrive. We're trying to measure and control humans as machines, but they're humans. They're not machines. And the final thing I want to talk about is Zach's vision, his positive vision of the future and what's possible. And the interesting starting point for this is when he talks about how people ask him, "What is your ideal school, Zach?" And he'll tell them, right? And then they get a bit flustered and they push back on him and they say, "No, that's not realistic," or "That's not possible." And he says what people are really asking is, "What's your ideal school given all the constraints of the world?" That's not the conversation he's interested in. He's interested in what's possible. What he's interested in is the social conditions that will enable a future of educational abundance in which the frontiers of human potential are open wide. He's really interested in human flourishing. And in his fourth essay here, he outlines those social conditions. The 13 miracles, he calls them. And these are bold experiments for society, often things that are quickly derided, things like a debt jubilee, universal basic income, and a reimagination of what our school systems could be and how our communities interact. Taken together, anyone who's a bit cynical or skeptical can quickly dismiss all of them. But they're fascinating ideas for starting points of conversations that get us past what is the ideal school in the current situation to what is possible if we imagine a world of educational abundance. And technology, instead of just offering online learning in the traditional vein, right? 20 kids in a Zoom classroom. I mean, come on, we can do better. We should be thinking about an educational abundance, right? We have so much knowledge and information out there. How can we imagine a world given that this abundance is starting to emerge and show itself? And he outlines this on page 203. To put it quite simply, most of our major social structures, such as labor markets and legal systems, are designed to promote economic growth, period. What if they were designed to promote human development and learning instead? What if the goal of society, as encoded in its very legal structures, was not the endless accumulation of wealth, but the endless actualization of human potential? This book is bold, it is provocative, and it's going to make you feel a little uncomfortable, but it's going to make you think. I admire Zach Stein because he's actually putting his money where his mouth is, and he's doing the work. He's investing in many different things, and he's been working on the front lines of education for multiple decades. Definitely recommend this book. Check out some of Zach Stein's work. He's got a bunch of other good podcasts. I'll link up some of the resources in the notes. If you like book reviews like this, let me know. This is my first one, and would appreciate any feedback, and let me know what I can improve in the next one. If you want to follow along, I create content on creating online, freelancing, making sense of our lives and our relationship with the work. What does lifelong learning mean? Things like this book. You can subscribe. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoy the review.